Static coated Susan's back teeth a full minute before the town sirens began their mechanical shrieking. Outside the grease-stained diner windows, the atmosphere wasn't darkening. It was bruising, a necrotic, heavy purple reeking of raw ozone and impending violence. Then a new rumble swallowed the room. Not thunder. 25 heavy Harleys shook the cheap floorboards, ridden by men in rain-slicked leather. Hell's Angels, outlaws. They didn't want coffee. They wanted shelter. Susan had a storm cellar and 3 seconds to decide. Susan dragged a gray, bleach-soaked rag across the cracked formica counter of the rust-stop diner. The motion was purely mechanical, leaving behind a smear of grease and the faint, stinging scent of ammonia that she knew would linger on her cuticles for days. She was 38, but the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights overhead had a cruel habit of adding a decade to her face. She didn't mind. Vanity was a luxury she couldn't afford on a margin of pennies and past-due notices. In the corner, the window air conditioning unit gave a violent, asthmatic shudder and died. Again. Susan sighed, dropping the rag into a stainless steel sink full of murky dishwater. She wiped a damp strand of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. The silence that followed the AC's death wasn't peaceful. It was thick, oppressive, and heavy. The air outside the massive, grease-stained front window hung completely motionless, trapped under a sky that looked entirely wrong. The edges of the horizon were a sickly, jaundiced green, swelling into a deep, necrotic purple directly overhead. Radio says it's touching down near Route 9, Old Man Henderson mumbled from his regular booth near the door. He was stirring a cup of black coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, the spoon clinking against the cheap ceramic with a nervous rhythm. Radio says a lot of things, Gary, Susan replied, drying her hands on her apron. But her stomach was tightening. She knew that sky. Anyone born in the flatlands of Kansas knew that sky. It felt like holding your breath just before a car crash. The birds had stopped singing an hour ago. The stray dogs had vanished. Then the vibration started. It didn't come from the sky. It came through the soles of Susan's worn orthopedic shoes, vibrating up through the cheap linoleum floor. A low, guttural, rhythmic thrumming that rattled the coffee cups in their saucers. Susan looked out the window. The gravel parking lot, usually empty save for a stray trucker or local farmhand, was suddenly swallowed by a swarm of chrome, matte black paint, and worn leather. 25 motorcycles, maybe more. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized fluidity, kicking up clouds of white limestone dust that hung stubbornly in the dead air. They cut their engines almost simultaneously. The sudden quiet that followed was infinitely worse than the noise. Susan's right hand dropped instinctively beneath the counter, her fingers brushing the cold, heavy steel of the tire iron she kept wedged next to the register. She watched the riders dismount. These weren't weekend warriors playing dress-up, accountants and dentists letting off steam. The leather cuts they wore were sun-faded, softened by miles, and smeared with road grime, flattened bugs, and engine oil. The infamous Death's head patch stared blindly from their backs, stark white thread stained yellow by nicotine and exhaust. Hell's Angels. The leader pushed open the glass door. The little brass bell above it gave a pathetic, high-pitched jingle that sounded absurdly out of place, like a child's toy dropped in a war zone. He was a mountain of a man. Not gym-built, but functionally dense, like a brick wall poured into denim and leather. His beard was aggressively graying, his knuckles a jagged roadmap of old scars and bad decisions. He smelled fiercely of unburned hydrocarbons, stale tobacco, and a sour, sharp sweat that told Susan everything she needed to know. He wasn't here to rob the register. He was afraid. "Ma'am," he said. His voice sounded like it had been dragged over miles of gravel. He didn't take off his oil-spattered sunglasses. "We need a place, now." Susan stood frozen. She looked at the giant, then past him to the 24 other men crowding her wooden porch, their eyes scanning the terrifying sky, mapping the horizon. She hated them on principle. She hated the noise, the inherent intimidation, the sheer, unapologetic arrogance of men who took up too much space and did whatever they pleased. Every instinct screamed at her to lock the deadbolt, to tell them the diner was closed, to force them to ride it out on the asphalt. A single drop of sweat rolled down her spine, chilling her. At that exact moment, the siren in town finally screamed to life, a shrill, desperate mechanical wail that sliced through the thick green air. "I have a cellar," she heard herself say. Her voice sounded thin, alien to her own ears. "Around back." The man gave a single curt nod. "No, thank you." No visible relief, just a pivot on a heavy steel-toed boot as he barked an unintelligible guttural order to the pack. Susan grabbed her keyring from the hook by the grill, leaving the cash register unlocked and open. It didn't matter. If the sky did what it looked like it was about to do, a fistful of damp $5 bills wasn't going to buy her a new life. She pushed past the big man, leading the way to the kitchen's rear exit. The air outside had plummeted 10 degrees in 2 minutes. It felt like walking into an industrial meat locker. The wind hadn't started blowing yet, but the distant horizon was no longer sky. It was a solid, churning wall of black earth and pulverized debris. It wasn't a funnel. It was a wedge, a mile-wide eraser dragging itself across the plains, coming directly for them. The cellar doors were heavy, warped planks of oak bound by rusted iron hinges, set flat into the concrete slab behind the kitchen. Susan dropped to her knees and struggled with the heavy brass padlock, her hands shaking so violently the key merely scratched and slipped against the metal casing. A massive hand, thick with yellow calluses and smelling intensely of hot metal, covered hers. "Let me," the leader said. His name, stitched on a fraying chest patch, read Tyrell, but the rocker beneath it said President. Susan scrambled backward, her chest heaving, oxygen suddenly feeling thin. Tyrell shoved the key in, twisted with brutal force, and ripped the padlock off, nearly pulling the rusted hasp out of the rotting wood. He threw the heavy doors open. A blast of stagnant air, smelling of damp earth, mildew, and ancient sprouting potatoes, drifted up. "Get in!" he roared over his shoulder to his men. The wind hit them. It didn't build gradually. It slammed into the back of the diner like a physical blow from a giant fist. The rusted corrugated tin roof of the kitchen groaned, a horrific tearing sound that vibrated directly into the roots of Susan's teeth. The bikers funneled down the narrow, creaking wooden stairs. There was no pushing, no blind panic, just a grim, rapid descent of heavily armed, leather-clad men. Susan watched them go, giants in their violent world, reduced in seconds to fleeing animals seeking a hole in the dirt. "You too, lady. Go." Tyrell grabbed her shoulder, his grip painfully tight, and shoved her toward the dark opening. Susan stumbled down the steps, her knees barking sharply against the hard wood as she slipped in the gloom. The root cellar was exactly 10 by 12 feet. It was barely enough room for her sparse inventory of canned crushed tomatoes, 50-pound sacks of flour, and bulk cleaning supplies. Now, it was instantly packed with 25 massive bodies. It was utterly suffocating. The sheer heat radiating from their bodies hit her like an oven blast. The space smelled intensely, overwhelmingly human: stale coffee, unwashed denim, nicotine, wet leather, unbrushed teeth, and the sharp, coppery tang of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. Tyrell was the last one down the stairs. He pulled the heavy wooden doors shut above them, plunging the cramped space into absolute, blinding darkness. He yanked a heavy steel logging chain from his belt, wrapping it blindly around the interior wooden handles, and bracing his considerable bulk against the ceiling. "Everyone down!" a voice barked from the dark. "Cover your heads and shut your mouths." Susan sank to the hard dirt floor, wedging herself between a rough burlap sack of potatoes and a thick leather-clad leg. She pulled her knees tightly to her chest, making herself as small as physically possible. Someone's heavy boot was pressing uncomfortably into her thigh. Someone else was breathing wetly, heavily, right next to her ear. It was an intolerable intimacy. She was trapped in the pitch black with 25 violent outlaws, people she would normally cross the street to avoid. Then, the train arrived. That's what the survivors always said on the local news stations. It sounded like a freight train. They were entirely wrong. A freight train was mechanical, metallic, predictable. This sound was organic and godless. It sounded like the earth itself was being ripped open by the seams. The barometric pressure dropped so violently and suddenly that Susan felt her eardrums pop outward. Her nose started to bleed, a warm, slick trickle she wiped away with a trembling, dirt-covered hand. Above them, the diner was dying. They could hear the exact, distinct moment the front plate glass windows blew out. A muffled, crystalline explosion. Then came the tearing. A horrible, shrieking grind of metal, snapping 2x4s and ripping drywall as the roof was violently peeled back from the walls. Fine! Gritty dust rained down continuously through the minute cracks in the cellar doors, coating the back of her throat. The man sitting next to Susan shifted in the dark, and suddenly she felt a heavy, leather-clad arm wrap firmly around the back of her head, forcing her face down into his chest. He smelled overwhelmingly like cheap motel bar soap and stale, dried beer. She didn't fight him. She surrendered to the grip, burying her face in the rough, abrasive leather, squeezing her eyes shut as the ground beneath them began to violently, rhythmically shake. "Hold the door!" someone screamed, though the voice was barely a fragile whisper over the deafening, all-consuming roar. Tyrell grunted above her, a primal, animalistic sound of pure physical exertion. The heavy cellar doors bowed upward toward the sky, the immense terrifying suction of the tornado trying to pluck them out of the ground like weeds. The steel chain rattled furiously. 3 other men scrambled up the short wooden stairs in the pitch black, throwing their combined weight against the straining wood, fighting the sky for their lives. Susan couldn't breathe. The air in the cellar was thick, saturated with pulverized topsoil, ancient dust, and fiberglass insulation. She coughed aggressively, choking on the dry air. The arm around her head tightened, not in comfort, but in restraint. "Breathe shallow," a gruff, anonymous voice near her right ear ordered. "It'll pass. Just breathe shallow, lady." It felt like an eternity. It was a suspended animation of terror, physical pain, absolute noise, and the crushing, suffocating weight of strangers in the dark. Susan lost her entire sense of self. She wasn't a struggling diner owner with bills she couldn't pay. She wasn't a woman who resented her life. She was just a frightened, fragile animal in a hole, surrounded by a pack of wolves waiting for the end of the world. And then, agonizingly slowly, the roar began to fade. It didn't stop cleanly, but it distanced itself, turning back into a mechanical hum, then a distant wail, and finally just the relentless, hollow howling of the prairie wind. No one moved for a long, heavy time. The darkness was still absolute. The silence that followed the deafening roar left a high-pitched ringing in Susan's ears. The quiet was punctuated only by the sounds of heavy, ragged breathing, the shuffle of boots on dirt, and someone hacking violently, trying to clear their lungs of the thick dust. "Is it gone?" a voice asked from the back corner, sounding surprisingly young. "Don't move yet," Tyrell ordered from the stairs. His voice was severely strained, completely breathless. Susan slowly, hesitantly pulled away from the chest she had been buried in. The leather jacket was damp with her own sweat and tears. I need to see," she whispered. Her voice was destroyed, her throat coated in a thick paste of dirt and saliva. Tyrell didn't argue with her. She heard the clinking rattle of the steel chain as he unwrapped it from the handles. He braced his shoulder and pushed against the right door. It didn't move an inch. He grunted, his boots slipping on the wooden steps as he pushed harder. "Debris on top," he muttered, his tone flat and practical. "Need some shoulders up here." 2 more massive men squeezed onto the narrow steps beside him. In the pitch black, Susan listened to the synchronization of their breath, the heavy rustle of thick leather, and then a massive, coordinated heave. The wood groaned under the pressure. Something impossibly heavy scraped loudly across the top of the exterior doors. "Again, on 3, Tyrell growled. 1, 2, 3, another brutal heave. A crack of light suddenly pierced the darkness. It was blindingly bright and entirely the wrong color. It wasn't the bruised, necrotic purple of the storm that had chased them underground. It was a sharp, mocking, impossibly clear afternoon yellow. With a final, roaring push, the men threw the cellar doors open, sending a twisted, jagged sheet of corrugated tin and half of a cinder block wall crashing to the dirt outside. More dust poured in, catching the sunlight, but so did the fresh air. It smelled bizarrely of snapped pine sap, raw, overturned dirt, ruptured underground gas lines, and crushed vegetation. Tyrell climbed out first, pulling himself up through the wreckage, followed by the others. Susan waited at the bottom, her legs trembling so violently she physically couldn't command them to stand. Finally, a thick, scarred hand reached down through the bright opening. She stared at it for a second, then took it. It hauled her up the stairs and out into the light with an effortless, terrifying strength. Susan stood on the top step, wiping the grit from her eyes, and looked at her life. The Rust Stop diner was gone, not severely damaged, not missing its roof or its front windows. It was gone. The rectangular concrete slab foundation had been swept entirely clean, save for the heavy cast iron flat-top grill that sat bolted in the exact center, looking like a bizarre rusted monument. The walls, the cheap, sticky linoleum, the asthmatic air conditioner, the cash register with the damp $5 bills, all of it had simply vanished, atomized and scattered across the flat Kansas fields for miles. Her beat-up, rust-spotted Chevy truck, which had been parked out front, had been picked up, crushed, and dropped entirely upside down on top of a sheared-off oak tree on the opposite side of the highway. Susan stared. She didn't cry. The capacity for tears had been completely squeezed out of her in the oppressive heat of the cellar. She didn't scream. She just felt a hollow, floating numbness, a complete dissociation from reality. 15 years of waking up at 4 in the morning, smelling like burned grease, fighting with suppliers, and soaking her aching feet in Epsom salts, entirely wiped out in less than 3 minutes. She turned her head slowly. The 25 Hells Angels were standing in a loose, scattered circle, silently surveying the utter devastation. Their bikes, miraculously, had been parked on the leeward side of the heavy concrete block wall of the diner's rear kitchen. The wall had collapsed outward rather than inward, creating a makeshift angled lean-to over the motorcycles. They were coated in a thick layer of gray dust and debris, scratched and dented, but mostly upright and intact. The bikers didn't look at her. There were no words of comfort, no dramatic speeches about surviving. They moved with a quiet, grim, mechanical efficiency. They immediately began pulling the heavy bricks, splintered 2x4s, and twisted metal off their machines. There was no shouting, no complaints about the damage, just the heavy rhythmic scrape of rubble being moved by calloused, unsympathetic hands. Susan stood there by the open cellar doors, feeling entirely invisible. She was a ghost haunting her own ruined property. Tyrell walked over, his boots crunching loudly on broken glass and shattered diner mugs. He looked at the perfectly clean concrete slab, then looked down at her. He reached into his inner leather vest pocket and pulled out a crushed, dusty pack of cigarettes. He offered her one, tapping the bottom of the pack. She shook her head slowly, her eyes tracking the movement, but not really registering it. He lit one for himself, cupping the flame of a brass Zippo against the lingering, cool breeze. The smoke drifted between them, smelling harsh, cheap, and undeniably real. "Insurance?" he asked. His voice was devoid of pity. Susan let out a dry, barking laugh that immediately ended in a painful cough, a cloud of dust escaping her lips. "Liability, not comprehensive. I couldn't afford the premiums. Bank takes the land." Tyrell took a long, slow drag, the cherry of the cigarette burning bright orange. He looked at the sky, now a serene, pale, mocking blue. "Tough break," he said. It wasn't sympathetic. It wasn't an apology. It was just a cold statement of fact. The world was incredibly hard, and it didn't care about fair. They both knew it. Within 20 minutes, the heavy bikes were entirely clear of the rubble. Starters whined and engines began to turn over, coughing out clouds of gray dust before settling into that familiar, aggressive, chest-rattling idle. The smell of exhaust overwhelmed the scent of the broken earth. Susan wrapped her arms tightly around herself, feeling suddenly, deeply cold despite the afternoon sun beating down on her face. She watched them mount up. They had exactly what they came for: survival. She was just the dirt hole they used to get it. Tyrell straddled his massive custom-built Harley. He kicked the heavy machine into gear, the metal clanking loudly. He paused, looking back over his shoulder at her standing alone by the cellar. For a second, just a microscopic fraction of a second, the hardened, impenetrable outlaw facade slipped. He didn't smile, and his expression didn't soften, but his eyes, surrounded by deep crow's feet and coated in white dust, met hers with a heavy, unspoken understanding, a recognition of a shared, brutal reality. He lifted a scarred hand, tapped his chest right over the frayed death's head patch, and gave her a single definitive nod. Then he aggressively rolled on the throttle. The pack pulled out of the ruined parking lot, navigating the scattered debris, downed power lines, and shattered wood with practiced, unbothered ease. They turned south, back onto the cracked, debris-strewn asphalt of Route 9, and roared away in a tight, disciplined formation. Susan watched them go until they were nothing but a dark, vibrating smudge on the heat-shimmering horizon, the sound of their massive engines entirely swallowed by the Kansas wind. She was completely alone, just a woman in a dust-covered apron standing on a bare concrete slab under a sky that didn't care she existed. She slowly walked over to the center of the foundation, sat down on the cold edge of the cast-iron grill, picked up a single, unbroken salt shaker from the dirt, and finally began to cry. The days that followed didn't feel like survival. They felt like a slow, bureaucratic drowning. Susan slept on a sagging, floral print sofa in her sister's cramped duplex 2 towns over. The living room smelled aggressively of cheap vanilla plug-in air fresheners and wet dog, a scent that clung to the back of Susan's throat every time she tried to eat the generic brand canned soup her sister kept offering. Her own clothes, the jeans and blouse she had been wearing when the sky tore open, had been washed 3 times, but the fine, gritty silt of the pulverized diner still lived inside the seams. She could feel it grinding against her skin when she shifted on the lumpy cushions. Survival, the news broadcast told her, was a miracle. The reality of it was deeply, humiliatingly mundane. It was sitting on hold for 4 hours with a regional insurance adjuster whose voice lacked any human inflection, listening to hold music that crackled with static. It was the tight, suffocating panic of realizing her checking account held exactly $412, and her next commercial property tax installment was due in 6 weeks for a patch of barren dirt she technically no longer owned because the bank was already moving to foreclose. She didn't feel strong. She felt intensely, viscerally stupid. She felt foolish for having poured 15 years of her life into a badly located diner just because her father had done the same. She resented the town for their brief performative pity. People she hadn't spoken to in a decade left voicemails layered with manufactured sympathy, offering prayers but no practical help. Prayers didn't pour concrete. Prayers didn't pay off a commercial lien. By day 6, the numbness began to wear off, replaced by a jagged, exhausting anger. She couldn't stay on the floral sofa anymore. The walls of the duplex were pressing inward. She borrowed her sister's beat-up Honda Civic, the steering wheel sticky with spilled soda, and drove back to Route 9. The county had erected a flimsy orange plastic snow fence around the perimeter of her property, though there was nothing left to protect. The caution tape snapped and hissed in the dry, relentless Kansas wind. Susan parked on the shoulder of the highway, ignoring the semi-trucks that blew past, rocking the small car in their wake. She ducked under the orange plastic and walked onto the concrete slab. It was smaller than she remembered. Without walls to give it context, the foundation looked pathetically tiny, a graveyard of a life. The heavy cast-iron flat-top grill still sat dead center, rusting rapidly in the humid air, turning a deep powdery orange. She hadn't come for closure. She came with a heavy steel crowbar she'd found in her sister's garage. Scrap metal. The grill had to weigh 600 pounds. If she could somehow pry the mounting bolts out of the concrete, maybe she could flag down a local farmer with a tractor to help her haul it to the salvage yard in Wichita. It was a pathetic, desperate plan, born of insomnia and poverty. She knelt on the concrete, the heat radiating through the knees of her jeans. The bolts were ancient, seized with decades of grease and newly formed rust. She wedged the forked end of the crowbar under the heavy iron lip and threw her weight into it. Nothing. The metal groaned slightly, but the bolts held fast. She tried again, panting, sweat stinging the corners of her eyes. The palms of her hands were blistering against the rough, knurled steel of the crowbar. She gritted her teeth, a bitter, hot spike of pure rage flaring in her chest. She pulled harder, leveraging her entire body weight, screaming a short, ugly expletive through her teeth. The crowbar slipped. Susan's momentum threw her backward. She hit the hard concrete hard, the back of her skull bouncing painfully off the sun-baked slab. The crowbar clattered away, a harsh metallic ringing that echoed in the empty air. She lay there, staring up at the pale, indifferent blue sky. The fight drained out of her, leaving nothing but an incredibly heavy, suffocating exhaustion. Her head throbbed with a sharp, rhythmic pain. The absurdity of it all crushed her. She was 38 years old, lying on her back on a ruined foundation in the middle of nowhere, fighting a piece of dead iron for $30 in scrap value. She closed her eyes, pressing the heels of her hands against her eyelids until she saw bursts of static color. She wanted to disappear into the concrete. Then she felt it. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a pressure, a deep tactile vibration that started in her spine and radiated outward into the concrete beneath her. It was entirely different from the heavy, godless earthquake of the tornado. This was rhythmic, symmetrical, mechanical. It was a low, rolling thunder that didn't belong to the sky. Susan sat up slowly, wincing at the dull ache in the back of her head. She looked south, down the long, shimmering stretch of black asphalt on Route 9. The heat waves distorting the air made the horizon ripple like water. A dark mass was cresting the distant hill. At first, her mind couldn't process the scale. It looked like a massive, rolling slick of black oil spilling over the asphalt. But as the rumble grew from a vibration into a defined, aggressive, overlapping roar of internal combustion, the shape broke apart into individual points of blinding chrome. Motorcycles, not 25. The convoy stretched back over the hill, entirely swallowing the two-lane highway. It was an endless, churning river of heavy machinery, leather, and denim. The noise grew from a rumble to a deafening, chest-rattling physical force. The air instantly smelled of burning rubber, hot exhaust, and high-octane fuel. Susan scrambled to her feet, instinctively taking a step backward, her hand blindly reaching out for the rusted grill to steady herself. The sheer volume of men and machines was terrifying. It triggered a deep primal flight response. They weren't passing by. The lead riders began to decelerate, the loud popping and cracking of downshifting engines filling the heavy air. They pulled onto the gravel shoulder of the highway, kicking up a massive, choking cloud of white limestone dust. More followed, and more. They lined the shoulder of Route 9 for a half-mile in either direction, an intimidating, militant blockade of the county road. The orange plastic snow fence was casually run over, flattened into the dirt without a second thought. Dozens of bikes pulled directly onto the grass surrounding her ruined foundation, killing their engines in a staggered, chaotic wave that left an aggressive ringing in Susan's ears, even after the noise stopped. Through the settling dust, a single rider pulled his heavy, matte-black Harley directly up to the edge of the concrete slab. Tyrell. He cut the engine. The silence that fell over the property was heavy, pregnant, and deeply uncomfortable. Hundreds of men, dressed in the sun-faded cuts of the Hells Angels, sat idling on their bikes or stood on the highway shoulder, staring at the empty dirt lot. It wasn't a triumphant movie moment. It felt like an occupation. Tyrell kicked his kickstand down with a heavy steel-toed boot. He didn't look heroic. He looked exhausted. His leather vest was coated in a fresh layer of highway grime, his graying beard tangled from the wind. He took off his mirrored sunglasses and hooked them onto the collar of his faded black t-shirt. He looked at Susan. He looked at the crowbar lying 10 feet away on the concrete. He looked at the rusted grill. "You're doing it wrong," he said. His voice was just as she remembered it, coarse, gravelly, completely lacking in warmth. Susan stood frozen, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. She was vastly outnumbered, entirely alone, and acutely aware of her own vulnerability. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, a defensive posture she couldn't suppress. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Her voice cracked, sounding fragile and defensive. She didn't sound grateful. She sounded cornered. Terrell didn't answer immediately. He walked onto the concrete slab, his heavy boots sounding loud in the quiet air. He stopped next to the grill, looked down at the seized bolts, and gave it a solid kick with the heel of his boot. It didn't budge. "Owe you a debt," he said, not looking at her, but surveying the empty space where her kitchen used to be. "You don't owe me anything," Susan snapped, the words rushing out of her in a panicked burst. "You needed a hole in the ground. I had one. You left. We're even. You can go." She wanted them to leave. The presence of 1,800 outlaws on her ruined property felt like a massive, terrifying spotlight on her failure. She didn't want an audience for her rock bottom. Terrell turned to face her. His eyes were hard, unreadable fragments of dark flint. "That's not how it works." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crushed pack of cigarettes, and lit one. He didn't offer her one this time. He took a drag, the smoke pluming from his nose. "My chapter was on a run. Got caught out. You opened a door you didn't have to open. Most people look at the patch. They lock the deadbolt." "I should have," Susan muttered bitterly, looking away, staring at a patch of dead grass. Yeah, probably," Tyrell agreed, completely unbothered. "But you didn't. 25 of my brothers went into the dirt. 25 came out. We don't leave debts unpaid. It's bad for the soul." He turned back toward the highway and gave 2 short, sharp blasts on a silver whistle he pulled from a leather lanyard around his neck. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The massive sea of bikers began to part. The deep, guttural roar of heavy diesel engines suddenly overpowered the idling motorcycles. 3 massive 18-wheeler flatbed trucks lumbered slowly down the center lane of Route 9, their air brakes hissing violently as they pulled to a stop directly in front of the property. Susan's breath caught in her throat. The first flatbed was stacked 15 feet high with banded bunks of raw, treated lumber. The pine sap smell hit the air instantly, fresh and sharp. The second truck was loaded with pallets of cinder blocks, bags of Portland cement, and heavy rolls of commercial-grade electrical wire. The third truck carried a Bobcat skid steer loader, a portable cement mixer, and an industrial generator. "What is this?" Susan whispered, taking a step backward, completely overwhelmed. Her hands started to shake. This wasn't happening. Things like this didn't happen in the real world. In the real world, the bank foreclosed. The insurance company denied your claim, and you died quietly on your sister's lumpy couch. "Materials," Tyrell said simply. He flicked his cigarette ash onto the concrete. "Called in a few favors from the coast. Had some brothers in construction clear out a supply yard in Tulsa. Drove it up overnight." He didn't hand her a blueprint or a contract. He didn't ask for her permission. He gestured vaguely to a group of massively built men stepping off their bikes, removing their heavy leather cuts to reveal sweat-stained undershirts and arms covered in heavy ink. "We got electricians. We got framers. Plumbers." Tyrell listed mechanically, pointing to different clusters of men. "The county inspector is going to turn a blind eye on account of a misunderstanding we cleared up with him this morning regarding your property line." Susan stared at him. The contradiction was tearing her apart. These men operated entirely outside the law. They intimidated, they enforced their own brutal code, and they solved problems with violence and fear. Yet here they were, marshaling an army of illicit labor and likely stolen materials to rebuild a greasy spoon diner for a woman they didn't know. "I can't pay for this," Susan said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The humiliation was sudden and suffocating. "I have $400 to my name. I can't feed you. I can't pay you." Tyrell stepped closer, bridging the distance between them. Up close, the smell of road dirt and stale smoke was overpowering. He looked down at her, his expression utterly devoid of pity. That was the most jarring part. He wasn't looking at a victim. He was looking at a peer. "Nobody asked for your money, Susan," he said, using her name for the first time. The sound of it coming from him was jarring. "You paid your tab in the cellar. Keep your $400. Buy a new sign." He turned away from her, shouting a series of harsh, barking orders over the rumble of the diesel engines. The invasion began. Hundreds of men swarmed the property. It was absolute chaos, yet entirely synchronized. A crew of 10 men manhandled the Bobcat off the trailer, its tracks chewing aggressively into the dirt as it began clearing the remaining heavy debris. A line of 30 bikers formed a human chain, rapidly unloading heavy cinder blocks hand by hand, stacking them near the foundation. Men with heavy sledgehammers approached the rusted flat-top grill. Susan stood frozen on the edge of the slab. She wasn't an architect or a foreman. She was entirely useless in her own rescue. A burly biker with a thick neck tattoo of a spiderweb accidentally bumped her shoulder as he carried a heavy roll of Romex wire past. "Watch your back, ma'am," he grunted, not stopping, entirely focused on his task. She wasn't in charge. She was just a bystander in the eye of a completely different kind of storm. The air filled with the deafening sounds of heavy machinery, shouting men, and the rhythmic ringing of steel on stone. The sheer overwhelming masculinity of it, the aggressive, unyielding forward motion, left her breathless. Terrell walked past her carrying a heavy pry bar. He stopped for a fraction of a second, looking at her pale, shocked face. "Grab a shovel or get out of the way," he said flatly. He didn't wait for a response. He walked toward the rusted grill, wedged the pry bar under the same bolt Susan had been fighting, and threw his massive weight against it. With a loud, violent crack, the rusted bolt snapped clean off. Susan stood in the dust, her fists clenched tightly at her sides. She looked at the crowbar she had dropped. She looked at the 1,800 outlaws tearing her ruined life apart to put it back together. She let out a long, ragged, shaky breath, tasting the dust and the pine sap on her tongue. She walked over, picked up the crowbar, and stepped into the chaos. The first blister tore open at 2 in the afternoon. Susan felt the sharp, stinging burn on the pad of her right thumb. She dropped the heavy, rough-cast cinder block onto the growing stack by the foundation, pulled off the oversized canvas glove she'd found in the dirt, and stared at the raw, weeping circle of pink skin. It throbbed in time with her heartbeat. She wiped the fluid roughly against the thigh of her jeans, spit on the wound to clear the gray dust, and pulled the glove back on. There was no time to bleed. There was no space for pity. The rebuild of the Rust Stop Diner was not a heartwarming cinematic montage. It was a brutal, deafening, hyper-aggressive assault on the senses. It was 100 degrees in the dead center of the Kansas sun, and the air was thick with a toxic slurry of diesel exhaust, pulverized concrete, and the sharp chemical reek of PVC primer. 150 men were actively working on the site at any given moment, operating in a chaotic rotation while the rest drank lukewarm water in the meager shade of the flatbed trailers or slept in the dirt. It looked entirely disorganized to Susan's eyes, a terrifying violation of every commercial zoning law and safety regulation in existence. Men in heavy denim and leather vests operated screaming circular saws inches from their own unprotected knees. They didn't wear hard hats. They wore bandanas soaked in sweat and grease. They smoked heavily while working near open containers of industrial solvent. And yet, the progress was terrifyingly fast. A massive, bearded man with Dutch stitched across his chest walked past Susan, carrying 2 90-pound bags of Portland cement on his shoulders like they were sacks of feathers. He didn't look at her. He didn't offer a polite smile. He just grunted, a low warning sound, expecting her to move. She scrambled backward, her boots slipping on the loose gravel, pressing her spine against the rusted flat-top grill to let him pass. "Mixer needs water," Dutch bellowed over the roar of the generators, his voice cutting through the mechanical din. Susan didn't think. She grabbed a heavy coiled green garden hose that had been spliced into the county main line by a biker with a wrench and a blatant disregard for municipal property, and dragged it toward the spinning concrete-caked drum. The water sputtered, coughing out a rust-brown sludge before running clear. She held the nozzle over the spinning drum, the cold water splashing back against her chest, soaking her thin cotton shirt. She hated this. The internal contradiction clawed at her throat. She was profoundly, desperately grateful, but she was also furious. She felt entirely displaced on her own land. The diner was the only thing in her life she had ever controlled, even if it was failing. Now, her salvation was entirely out of her hands, orchestrated by a violent syndicate who communicated in grunts, whistles, and barked obscenities. They weren't asking her how she wanted the kitchen laid out. They were just building it. Around 3 o'clock, Gary Henderson's rusted Ford Taurus crawled slowly past the property line on Route 9. Susan paused, the hose still running into the mixer, and watched the old man. Gary had eaten 2 eggs over easy at her counter every morning for 9 years. Now, he was driving 5 miles under the speed limit, staring wide-eyed at the sprawling, intimidating encampment of outlaws. He didn't honk. He didn't pull over to ask if she was okay. He stared for a long, uncomfortable moment, then accelerated, fleeing back to the safety of town. A heavy, dark wave of isolation washed over her. The town had already written her off. They wouldn't come back. They would see the patched leather vests, the death's heads, the sheer volume of intimidating men, and they would stay away. Even if this building went up, who was going to eat here? "You're flooding it, lady." Susan snapped back to reality. A younger biker, maybe 25, with a jagged scar running from his ear to his collarbone, was glaring at her. The concrete mixer was overflowing, a thick gray slurry spilling onto the dirt. She quickly released the nozzle handle, her face flushing violently. "Sorry, I was just looking at the road." The young biker stepped up to the mixer, grabbed a heavy wooden hoe, and began scraping the spillage back toward the drum. "Don't look at the road," he said, his tone flat and utterly unsympathetic. "Road ain't building your walls. Pay attention to the dirt." He didn't say it to be cruel. He said it because it was a mechanical fact. If she wasn't useful, she was a liability. Susan swallowed hard, the dry lump in her throat tasting like chalk. Right. The dirt. She coiled the hose and walked back to the stack of cinder blocks. She picked one up. Her shoulders screamed in protest, the muscles burning with a sharp lactic fire. She carried it 20 feet to the trench where the new plumbing lines had been laid, dropped it with a heavy thud, and walked back for another. No one thanked her. No one told her to take a break. For the first time in her life, Susan Torres was just another grunt in the crew. The sun didn't set. It surrendered, bleeding a bruised, violent red across the flat horizon before collapsing into absolute black. But the work didn't stop. Massive industrial halogen work lights powered by 3 roaring diesel generators bathed the dirt lot in a harsh, clinical yellow glare. The lights cast long, distorted shadows of the men, making them look like giants moving across a barren moonscape. The air cooled rapidly, dropping from a suffocating 100 degrees to a sharp, biting 60. The contrast made Susan's sweat-soaked shirt cling to her skin like ice. The air smelled intensely of fresh sawdust, hot steel, cheap beer, and burning meat. Dozens of small campfires had been built in heavy steel barrels on the perimeter, where off-shift men were charring generic brand hot dogs on the ends of straightened wire coat hangers. Susan sat on an overturned empty 5-gallon bucket of joint compound. Her body was a map of new agonies. Her lower back was locked in a rigid spasm, her hands were trembling uncontrollably from muscle fatigue, and her boots felt like they were filled with wet lead. She looked up at the foundation. It wasn't just a slab anymore. The skeleton was up. The speed of the framing was beyond human comprehension. They had used pneumatic nail guns, the rapid thwack, thwack, thwack echoing across the empty plains like bursts of automatic gunfire. The pale, raw pine 2x4s stood in perfect, rigid lines against the night sky. It was bigger. Susan stared at the footprint, her exhausted brain trying to calculate the dimensions. The old diner had seated 40 people comfortably. This framing extended 10 feet further out toward the highway, and at least 15 feet deeper toward the back property line. Heavy boots crunched on the gravel behind her. She didn't turn around. She knew the heavy, asymmetrical rhythm of Tyrell's walk by now. He stopped beside her, holding two dripping, ice-cold cans of cheap lager. He wordlessly pressed one against the side of her neck. Susan flinched at the sudden, sharp cold, then reached up and took the can. The aluminum was beaded with condensation. She cracked the tab. The hiss was loud in the brief lull between circular saw cuts. She took a long drink. It was bitter, cheap, and entirely perfect. It washed the taste of pulverized concrete out of her teeth. Tyrell sat down on a stack of raw lumber next to her, resting his heavy forearms on his knees. He popped his own beer and drank half of it in a single, uninterrupted swallow. He looked utterly drained. The deep lines around his eyes were caked with gray dust, making him look older, harder. "It's too big," Susan said. Her voice was hoarse, shredded from breathing dust and yelling over the generators all day. Tyrell didn't look at her. He stared at the yellow-lit skeleton of the building. Standard commercial footprint, 4,000 square feet. "My permit was for 2,000, Susan replied, a knot of fresh anxiety tightening in her stomach. "The county inspector, the zoning board, they're going to measure it. They're going to tear it down." Tyrell let out a short, dry exhale that might have been a laugh if it had carried any humor. He crushed the empty beer can in his massive fist with a sharp metallic pop and tossed it into a nearby trash barrel. "Inspector came by at noon while you were hauling blocks," Tyrell said casually, pulling a rag from his back pocket and wiping the grease from his knuckles. "We had a conversation." Susan turned her head slowly, her neck protesting the movement. "What kind of conversation?" "The kind where I explained the virtues of rapid economic development in a disaster zone," Tyrell said deadpan. He finally turned his head to look at her, his dark eyes catching the harsh glare of the halogens. "And the kind where I mentioned that his brother-in-law's auto body shop over in Wichita buys a lot of aftermarket parts from unverified suppliers. Suppliers we happen to do a lot of business with." Susan stared at him, her mouth slightly open. The sheer casual corruption of it made her head spin. "You blackmailed the county inspector." "I negotiated an expedited variance," Tyrell corrected, his face entirely blank. He agreed the new dimensions looked structurally sound, stamped the paperwork on the hood of his cruiser. "You're legal." Susan looked back at the massive wooden skeleton. She was now legally bound to a building born of extortion, built with likely stolen lumber, by men who viewed the law as a mild inconvenience. The pristine, innocent image of her father's old diner was dead and gone. This new place was stained with their presence before the drywall was even hung. "Why?" she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop it. "Don't give me that bad for the soul crap. Nobody brings 1,800 men across state lines because of a root cellar." Tyrell was quiet for a long time. He pulled his Zippo, flicking the wheel, staring at the small orange flame dancing in the wind. "You didn't ask for money," he said softly, the gravel in his voice scraping the cold air. "When we climbed out of that hole, you were standing there, your whole life wiped clean down to the dirt. Most people, they'd be screaming. They'd be begging for a handout, demanding we pay for the damages even though the sky did it." He snapped the lighter shut. The sudden darkness between them felt heavy. "You just offered me a smoke, looked at your ruined life, and took it," Tyrell continued. "You didn't play the victim. In our world, you respect the people who can take a beating and stay on their feet. You're not a civilian, Susan. Not anymore. You're one of the ones who survived the dirt." He stood up, his heavy leather boots grinding into the gravel. He looked down at her, a massive shadow blocking out the harsh work lights. "We don't build churches," Tyrell said, his tone returning to its normal, abrasive baseline. "But we build walls that don't fall down. Get some sleep. Roof trusses arrive at dawn, and I need you on the nail gun." He turned and walked back toward the chaotic glare of the halogens, leaving Susan alone in the dark. She sat on the plastic bucket, the cold beer numbing her blistered hand, and stared at the massive wooden bones of her new life. It was ugly. It was compromised. It was terrifying. But for the first time since the sky turned green, she knew it wasn't going to blow away. Dawn broke over the Kansas plains like a bruised peach, spilling a hazy, humid light across the skeletal frame of the new rust-stop diner. The air was already heavy, thick with the metallic tang of compressor oil and the sharp, piney scent of freshly milled lumber. Susan didn't sleep. She had spent the 4 hours of mandated downtime sitting on a stack of drywall, staring blindly into the dark, her hands wrapped tightly in silver duct tape to cover the weeping blisters. When the heavy diesel rumble of the crane truck vibrated through the soles of her boots at 4 in the morning, she simply stood up, her joints cracking in loud, dry protests, and walked toward the noise. The roof trusses arrived in a massive banded bundle, dangling from the crane's steel cable like the ribbed spine of a leviathan. "Up!" Tyrell roared, his voice cutting through the hiss of air brakes and the mechanical clatter of the crane. He was standing on the top plate of the framed wall, 15 feet in the air, balancing on a 2x4 with terrifying casual grace. He wore no safety harness. None of them did. A heavy, grease-stained pneumatic nail gun was shoved roughly into Susan's chest. She stumbled backward, catching the heavy yellow plastic and steel tool before it hit the dirt. She looked up. Dutch, the massive biker who had been hauling cement the day before, glared down at her. A thick, coiled yellow air hose trailed from the bottom of the gun like a synthetic umbilical cord. "You're on blocking," Dutch grunted, pointing a massive calloused finger toward the interior walls. "When the truss drops, you shoot the hurricane ties. 4 nails per bracket. Don't miss the wood, or you'll put a 3-inch spike through the guy holding the other side." He didn't ask if she knew how to use it. He simply turned his back and climbed a rickety aluminum ladder. Susan stared at the nail gun. It weighed a solid 8 pounds. She pressed the tip against a scrap piece of lumber on the ground and pulled the trigger. Whack. The recoil punched hard into her wrist, a violent, instantaneous release of pressurized air that drove a 3-inch galvanized nail flush into the pine. The power of it was intoxicating. It wasn't like scrubbing grease off a flat top or arguing with a meat supplier over a past due invoice. It was definitive. It was violent, permanent creation. "First truss coming down!" a voice screamed from the roofline. Susan scrambled up the interior scaffolding, her boots slipping on the dew-slicked aluminum. The heat of the day was already building, trapping the exhaust from the crane in the enclosed space of the framed walls. She reached the top just as the massive triangular wooden truss was lowered into the steel brackets. 2 bikers on either side wrestled the heavy wood into place, their biceps bulging, sweat pouring down their tattooed necks in dirty, gray rivulets. "Nail it!" one of them barked, his face red with exertion. Susan shoved the heavy steel tip of the nail gun into the metal bracket. She pulled the trigger. The gun kicked violently, slamming her shoulder backward. She adjusted her grip, gritted her teeth, and fired 3 more times in rapid succession. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The truss held fast. "Next one!" Tyrell yelled from 50 feet down the line. For the next 6 hours, Susan existed in a state of hyper-focused dissociation. She didn't think about her empty bank account. She didn't think about the ruined, upside-down Chevy truck rusting in the ditch across the highway. She became a machine, a synchronized part of the violent, rhythmic assembly line. Load the coil, climb the scaffold, wait for the heavy thud of the wood, aim, fire, reload. By noon, the sun was a white-hot anvil pressing down on the flat roof. The framing was finished. The plywood decking went up next. Sheets of oriented strand board slammed down and nailed into place with a deafening, overlapping roar of 50 pneumatic guns firing simultaneously. Then came the tar. The smell hit the air like a physical blow. Thick, acrid, and nauseatingly chemical. Men dragged heavy motorized kettles of boiling black asphalt onto the roof, slathering it over the seams. The heat radiating off the black surface pushed the ambient temperature past 110 degrees. Susan's vision blurred. The edges of the world turned fuzzy and gray. She swayed on the scaffolding, the heavy nail gun slipping from her sweat-slicked fingers. A hand clamped onto the back of her collar, pulling her violently backward. She collapsed onto the plywood decking, gasping for air that felt like inhaled fire. Terrell was standing over her, holding a lukewarm plastic bottle of water. He unscrewed the cap and dumped half of it directly onto her face. The shock of it snapped her back to reality. She sputtered, wiping the muddy water from her eyes with her taped hands. "You're done up here," Terrell said flatly. "Go down to the kitchen. Electricians are wiring the flat top." "I can keep going," Susan rasped, trying to push herself up. Her arms trembled so violently they refused to bear her weight. Terrell knelt beside her. The smell of boiling tar and stale nicotine rolled off him in waves. "You're a liability when you're passing out, Susan. The roof is sealed. It won't leak and it won't blow off. Go downstairs." She nodded slowly, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a hollow, aching fatigue. She climbed down the ladder, each rung feeling like a knife against her bruised arches. She walked into the deep, artificial shade of the interior. It was cooler here, the thick cinder-block walls trapping the nighttime air. She stood in the center of what used to be her dining room. It was unrecognizable. The space was cavernous, smelling of fresh drywall mud, PVC primer, and the metallic tang of newly stripped copper wire. The ghost of the rust-stop diner had been thoroughly exorcised, buried under tons of concrete, steel, and outlaw sweat. She leaned against a cool, raw cinder-block wall and slid slowly to the concrete floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She closed her eyes, listening to the muffled, deafening roar of creation happening above her, and for the first time in 10 days, she slept. The silence woke her. It was absolute and terrifying. The constant, chest-rattling drone of the diesel generators was gone. The overlapping bark of nail guns, the shriek of circular saws, and the heavy grinding treads of the bobcat had vanished. Susan snapped her eyes open. She was lying on a brand-new deep crimson vinyl booth. The sunlight streaming through the massive, commercial-grade, impact-resistant front windows was soft, angling low across the pristine, black-and-white checkered linoleum floor. She sat up slowly, her joints popping loudly in the quiet space. The diner was finished. It didn't look like a quaint country kitchen. It looked like a machine built for war. The countertops were 2-inch thick solid oak, stained a deep bruised mahogany. The stools bolted to the floor were heavy cast iron and black leather. The kitchen behind the counter was a gleaming, sterile expanse of heavy-gauge stainless steel. The old, rusted flat-top grill had been dragged out and replaced with a massive 10-burner commercial range that looked like it could forge weapons. There were no frilly curtains. There were no generic faded landscape paintings on the walls. The aesthetic was deeply, unapologetically brutalist. Wood, steel, concrete, leather. Susan stood up, her boots squeaking sharply on the clean floor. She walked to the front door. It was solid steel, encased in a heavy steel frame, featuring a deadbolt the size of her fist. She pushed it open and stepped out onto the concrete porch. The gravel parking lot, which had been a chaotic, churning war zone of heavy machinery and violent men for 2 solid weeks, was entirely empty. The 1,800 motorcycles were gone. The flatbed trucks were gone. The piles of scrap and debris had been cleanly scraped away by the bobcat and hauled off. All that remained was a smooth, neatly graded expanse of crushed white limestone, blindingly bright in the mid-morning sun. They hadn't said goodbye. There was no grand ceremony, no ribbon cutting, no speeches about community or resilience. They had simply finished the job, packed their tools, mounted their heavy, oil-leaking machines, and vanished back into the American highway system like a phantom army. Susan stood on the porch, feeling a bizarre, hollow ache in her chest. She was alone again. But the aloneness felt different this time. It wasn't the fragile, exposed isolation of a woman waiting for the next disaster to ruin her. She was standing in the mouth of a fortress. A heavy, matte black Harley-Davidson idled softly near the edge of the highway. Tyrell was sitting on the bike, both boots planted firmly on the asphalt. He wasn't looking at the diner. He was looking south down the long, shimmering stretch of Route 9. Susan walked off the porch, her boots crunching loudly in the fresh gravel. She stopped 10 feet from the bike. Terrell didn't turn his head. He took a final, long drag off a cigarette and flicked the butt into the ditch. "It's overbuilt," Susan said, her voice sounding raspy and small in the open air. Tyrell finally looked at her. He reached into his leather vest, pulled out a heavy, dull brass key, and tossed it. Susan caught it instinctively. It was cold and heavy. "Front door," Tyrell said. His gravelly voice was low, barely audible over the deep, rhythmic thrumming of his engine. "Building is up to code, mostly. The fire suppression system in the kitchen is commercial grade. Don't touch the red valve unless you're actually burning alive." Susan looked down at the key in her palm. The jagged teeth dug into her blistered skin. "I still can't pay you for this." "Nobody is coming to collect, Susan," Tyrell said flatly. He gripped the heavy clutch lever. "We settled our tab. You got a roof that won't blow off. We got our souls clean." He kicked the bike into gear with a heavy metallic clank. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't offer a smile. He looked at her one last time, his dark eyes entirely devoid of sentimentality. "Don't lose the key," he grunted, "and charge more for the coffee. You're giving it away." He rolled on the throttle, the massive engine roaring to life, drowning out whatever Susan might have said in response. He pulled onto the asphalt, banked hard to the south, and accelerated rapidly, quickly becoming a dark, vibrating speck against the flat Kansas horizon. Susan watched him go until the sound of the engine was entirely swallowed by the wind. She stood in the dust for a long time, the heavy brass key warming in her closed fist. She turned and walked back into the diner. The silence inside was thick, but it was no longer oppressive. It was the silence of a held breath, waiting to be exhaled. She walked behind the heavy oak counter, her hands tracing the cold, smooth stainless steel of the new coffee urns. She found a bag of generic grounds in a newly installed soft-close cabinet. She tore it open, the rich, bitter smell grounding her. She started the brewer, the machine sputtering and hissing to life, filling the sterile air with the deeply human scent of cheap coffee. 10 minutes later, the heavy steel front door opened. The new brass bell above it didn't jingle with a pathetic, high-pitched tinkle. It struck with a deep, resonant, heavy chime. Gary Henderson stood in the doorway. The old man looked terrified. He stared at the massive black leather booths, the industrial steel kitchen, the thick cinder-block walls. He looked like he had accidentally wandered into a maximum security prison. He hovered on the threshold, his eyes darting nervously, half expecting a heavily tattooed enforcer to drag him out by his collar. Are you open, Susan?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Susan picked up a heavy, thick-walled white ceramic mug. She held it under the spout, filling it with pitch-black steaming coffee. She set it on the polished oak counter. It hit the wood with a heavy, satisfying thud. She looked at the old man. She didn't force a warm customer service smile. She didn't pretend everything was normal. Her hands were wrapped in dirty silver duct tape. Her hair was a tangled mess of dust and sweat, and she felt like she had been beaten with a tire iron. "Yeah, Gary," Susan said, her voice rough, cynical, and completely unbreakable. "We're open. Sit down." If you felt the raw tension of Susan's survival and the unpredictable encounter with these hardened outlaws, this story is just getting started. What happens when you lose everything, only to have the most dangerous men in the country remember a debt? Drop a like to show your support. Share this with someone who loves a gritty, real-life story of unexpected redemption. And make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the mind-blowing moment 1,800 bikers return.